and cover in this group. We are going to be learning, it's a 3-part series, right? And this is 1.
Yes.
Okay, Gospel of Mark.
Yes.
Here we go, Gospel of Mark. Thank you so much, Dr. Sarah Emanuel.
Awesome. Thank you. Hi, everyone. It's really good to be back. Thank you for inviting me again. It's always, such a joy to teach to folks who want to be here as opposed to students who are, forced to take a core class. So really happy to be here. So yeah, this is a 3-part course on the Gospel of Mark. Today will just be, very basic introductory material on Mark's relationship with the New Testament and New Testament texts, sort of like what are Gospels, how do Gospels relate to the larger New Testament canon, and, sort of touching some of the basics with regards to dating and authorship for Mark. And then session 2 and 3 will go more into specifics on how is Mark characterizing Jesus, who is Jesus according to this author, and one of my favorite topics of Mark, who are the disciples for this author. So fun fact, I was asked to do this class not on Mark, but on Matthew. Matthew is the first gospel within the canonical order. So when you open up your New Testament, there are 27 books within the canonized New Testament material, and Matthew is the first gospel and Mark is the second gospel. Many scholars, however, think that Mark was written first. So even though in the canonical order, Matthew comes first, in the chronological order, many, if not most, think that Mark is written first. That's not the reason, though, that I asked to do Mark. I asked to do Mark because I actually think that Mark is the most fun. I think Mark is humorous. I think it might actually be a comedy. We will talk about that, not so much today, but certainly in the next 2 classes. So just keep that on the mind. Mark's gospel has been read for quite a bit of satire and quite a bit of humor. So today is just going to be, more information thrown at you. And then the next 2 classes will sort of like bring more discussion into the room. But as I, sort of throw out the information, please feel free to raise a hand, interrupt. I enjoy dialogue and engagement. I don't find it rude whatsoever to raise a hand in the middle of a sentence. Please do. And we'll sort of, get this material out there together. Okay, so before I dive in, I'll even just ask, are there any questions on anything I just said, on the plan of attack, what we're doing today? Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so did they not know it was written before Matthew when they put the Bible together, or?
Yeah, well, who knows? Who knows? So, if there's one thing you'll learn from any of my courses, it's that we know so much less than we think that we do, or that we sometimes say that we do. So everything that I'm going to say in this class, please take with a grain of salt. It is completely possible that in 10 years, everything I'm saying will be turned around. Just for an example, you may have heard of the famous and perhaps infamous Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in a set of caves near the Dead Sea, just outside of Jerusalem. Jerusalem to the Dead Sea caves is, an easy day trip by car from the Jerusalem city center. And the first cave with some texts inside were discovered in 1947. And from that discovery, our entire understanding of early Judaism and how the Jesus movement fits into early Judaism was turned on its head. And so in the grand scheme of history, that's remarkably recent. So all of that is to say, there could be a discovery of texts tomorrow. There could be a discovery of text already, and some scholars are just holding on to it and have signed some sort of like agreement where they can't share the news. So, we could find something in the ground that just completely, once again, turns what we think about history on its head. It's happened, already happened in the 20th century, and it could happen again. So truly, everything I'm sharing today, it's best guess based on the information that we have. Yeah.
I'm curious, those caves, were they not accessible until 1947? Why hasn't somebody gone in there before that?
Maybe someone found them prior, but as far as we know, scholarly eyes hadn't hadn't laid sight on them. They were hidden in the 1st century of the Common Era, likely in the wake of the Jewish-Roman War, which started around 67 of the Common Era. Folks wanted to hide their texts, perhaps to save them, to protect them from the Roman army, and they hid them in caves, and they did a really good job at hiding them because it took centuries. Yes, yeah. So the texts themselves that have been discovered, most of them are fragments, but textual critics, those who really specialize in dating texts and trying to piece together the fragments into some sort of cohesive whole, date all of those texts around the early centuries BCE up to the mid-century of the Common Era. But the point of all this is to say a bunch of sources were discovered in the last century, and it changed everything. So it could happen again. So everything that I'm saying today, I cannot stress, it is not 100% fact. Even when I make it seem like it is, who knows? Okay, really, we don't know. Okay, any other questions before we get started on Mark and gospel literature? Okay, so yeah, gospel according to Mark, in scare quotes, as we'll talk about more in detail. We actually have no idea who wrote this text. But we're gonna start with what Mark is and what Mark isn't. And more specifically, let's start with what Mark isn't. Mark is not a glimpse into the historical Jesus. Mark is not a narrative set up or designed to tell us specifics about this man's life. Historical Jesus scholarship does, however, rely on gospel material to figure out who he might have been. But when doing historical Jesus research, scholars cannot rely on one gospel alone. So scholars will rely on anything and everything that they have, which is not much. In the grand scheme of things, most things that we have about this man who was called Jesus, and we have to keep in mind that Jesus is, that name is a translation from Greek, which is a translation from Aramaic. So people weren't calling him Jesus in antiquity. In antiquity, people were calling him Yeshua. And if we were to translate Yeshua directly from Aramaic or Hebrew into English, bypassing Greek, bypassing the Latinization of the name, it would be Joshua, which for the time period in antiquity and also today is a remarkably Jewish name. So already the name gives us some sort of indication as to who he might have been. Joshua, some sort of Jew in the 1st century of the Common Era. So the texts that talk about this guy, Joshua, are limited. We have very, very, very minimal resources that say anything about this person. Most of the texts that talk at length about him are gospels. Gospels means good news. So we have a New Testament canon, right, that Christians read today as part of their sacred scripture. When you open up that New Testament, there are, as I said before, 27 books within it. 4 of those books are called Gospels, good news, narratives of the good news of this guy, Josh. So they're already at the outset claiming to be biased. They're saying, we are understanding this person, Josh, in a good way. There are, however, additional gospel sources that were not canonized into the New Testament. So based on the information that we have, the historical Jesus, this guy who lived in antiquity, lived based on our calendar system today from what we would date to about 4 BCE, 4 before the Common Era, to 30 of the Common Era. So folks got the calendar wrong. The Gregorian calendar is slightly off based on our evidence. Folks thought, okay, BCE, or more accurately, it's a Christian calendar before Christ and AD, meaning in the year of our Lord. They thought it would be, okay, well, the turn of the era is when Jesus was actually born. They likely got it a few years off. So based on the Gregorian calendar, this person lived from about 4 BCE to 30 of the Common Era. And texts at the time of his life were not written about him. People were not writing about his situation. First of all, most people could not read or write. Only 10% of the population could read or write. We have very limited evidence indicating that Jesus could have read or written, or that any of his disciples could have read or written. We have no indication. Most scholars assume that Jesus was illiterate, as most people were illiterate. But after his death, after 30, in the decades later, people started to share stories orally about this person, and then eventually started to write them down. Of course, again, the people who could write were of, the upper classes. They were the educated. So we're getting a biased view of Jesus through the lens of good news, and we're also getting Jesus through the lens of the educated elite, likely men. It's very unlikely that women wrote any texts within the New Testament or any texts about Jesus outside of the New Testament. So oral stories are happening about this guy after he died, and then texts are starting to be written. The first text perhaps is Mark in and around 70 of the Common Era, and I'll talk more about that time period in a minute. I just want to highlight that other texts after Mark were also written, which indicates that people had, nuanced views. People said, this isn't enough. There's something out, there's something missing from this version. Let me add something else. So all of the gospel texts are talking about the same person from the perspective of, he did good things, but they're all slightly different. So every gospel source that we have depicts a slightly different version of Jesus because it's a different author making sense of who he was. So we have 4 that are canonized in the New Testament, and then we have a bunch of other ones that were not chosen to be canonized. So you have stories of Jesus happening after he died. People are writing after he died. People are arguing about who he was and how best to understand him, how best to follow him, how best to make sense of him. Who was he? What is his essence? Is he fully human? Is he fully divine? Is he both? How does one best follow him? Does one be Jewish? Does one be Gentile? Does one mix the two? And all of these differences and debates are happening for centuries after Jesus died. And it's not until the end of the 4th century of the Common Era that we have a New Testament that is the New Testament today. So you have to keep in mind that hundreds of years passed before we have a New Testament, and that lots of stories were circulating about Jesus orally, but only 4 of them were canonized into the New Testament in the 4th century. All of it is to say, yes, people were talking about him, not to the same length that we wish. We wish we had more information. The texts that we have to rely on about Jesus of Nazareth are in large part gospel materials, but there were other gospel texts that were written about Jesus that are lost to us, were not canonized in the New Testament. There are some gospels that have been found that were not canonized that give totally different versions of who Jesus was from the 4 gospels in the canon. So all of this is to say, we have very limited resources. The resources that talk about him the most are gospel stories, narratives of the good news of Jesus of Nazareth. Only 4 gospels total were canonized into the New Testament. There were other ones. Each gospel depicts Jesus differently, including the 4 in the New Testament. They all have different versions of who Jesus was.
Okay,
Who were the people that decided what the 4 gospels would be, and how were they chosen?
Yeah.
To do that?
So I'm going to give as quick of an answer as I can, but that's absolutely like its own class on authorization and canonization. But you have to keep in mind power and power plays. So by the time we get to the 4th century of the Common Era, Rome is on the side of a particular version of Christ following groups, a version that is Gentile specific, that does not support being Jewish and following Jesus as the Christ, that believes that Jesus is equally human and divine. There were lots of contested ideas about Jesus's essence and, again, how to follow him. So basically, our first canon comes around 367 of the Common Era by a guy named Athanasius, and that 27 book list is supported by the powers that be, which is Rome. And so you had elite, governmental figures supporting this particular version, but it took hundreds of years to finally get to that point.
A couple questions. You said that there's a likelihood that Christ and his immediate circle were illiterate. Does that mean that they are also unfamiliar with the Hebrew scriptures, so that they would be unable to quote it, for example, because you see,
yeah, that's an excellent question. Absolutely not. No.
Okay.
To not be able to read or write does, oh yeah. So the question is, when I say that Jesus and his followers are illiterate, does that mean that they are not familiar with text, including Jewish scriptures of the time period? And my answer is absolutely not. Orality was enmeshed in daily life. So like, I don't know if any of you remember even just 20 years ago, the amount of phone numbers you could keep in your head. Like how many of you can remember a new phone number? Like we lose it so quickly, but when you are enmeshed in a world in which your way of sharing details is through oral story, you learn to remember those stories. So, there are some scholars who do think that maybe Jesus could have read, at the very least read something. It's possible. But given that most people couldn't, most scholars assume perhaps Jesus, could not read or write. But based on the evidence that we have, which again is slim, but based on the evidence that we have, he was familiar deeply with texts and traditions, deeply familiar with Jewish texts and traditions, and would have been told stories. He would have listened to stories and would have internalized stories and interpreted those stories and then shared his understanding of those stories. So just because he couldn't read, just because he couldn't write, doesn't mean he's not educated through oral transmission.
And then second, has subsequent research suggested that the non-canonical Gospels are as reliable as the ones that made the canon?
Great question. So the question is, where are scholars with regards to trusting the reliability of Gospels in the canon versus Gospels outside of the canon? Which do scholars rely on more for historical Jesus work? And so, okay, a historical Jesus scholar, a scholar interested in unpacking the life and times of this historical figure, will not prioritize the canon, meaning they understand that there were lots of stories written about Jesus, and a certain group of people got to decide, humans got to decide which stories were named canon. And so the canon is, just wide open. There is no canon for scholars trying to do historical work of Jesus and antiquity. So they will get anything and everything they can get their hands on and try to say, okay, based on all this material that we have, which again is limited, but based on everything that we have, canon and not canon, what can we understand about Jesus of Nazareth? So the first point is canon is not prioritized in doing research about Jesus and antiquity. However, most of the materials that are not canonized seem to have been written later. And sometimes scholars, even though just because something's written earlier doesn't mean that it's automatically more factual, but sometimes scholars will lean into the camp of, by the time we get to the later material, perhaps we do lose some of the more historical pieces. And the non-canonical Gospels, aside from a gospel called the Gospel of Thomas, are much more metaphorical in vibe, I could say. They don't seem to hit at the same kind of potential historicity as the Gospels in the New Testament. Again, there's another gospel called the Gospel of Thomas. It's a saying source. It's just a list of, and Jesus said X, and Jesus said Y, and Jesus said A, and Jesus said B. So even though canon as a concept is not prioritized when doing historical Jesus research, the Gospels that are canonized tend to potentially answer questions that we have more than the non-canonical Gospels that tend to be a little more metaphorical. Does that answer your question? I assume it does. Yeah.
Very ably.
You said that Jesus is totally illiterate, but yet in the Bible it says that he read the Torah
Mm-hmm.
And then discussed it with the elders.
Yeah. So this is a pushback that I get a lot from my students. So here's the thing. That's not really multiply attested. So we don't have ample evidence to go off of. If something comes up once, maybe twice, that's not enough. So historical Jesus scholars will look at all the material, and they will follow a set of guidelines, a set of principles to try to decipher what might or might not be more or less likely historically viable. So, so this is jumping ahead a little bit, but for example, let's just take the 4 Gospels in the New Testament. If you go with the assumption that Mark is written first, you take with you an assumption that Matthew and Luke had copies of Mark. So here's the thing. Based on the evidence that we have, Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus from Nazareth, which is in Galilee, is from a Jewish region with a Jewish name, talking about Jewish things. Like his entire shtick is Jewish theology. Jesus is fundamentally enmeshed in Judaism. And so for a Jew in Galilee in the 1st century of the Common Era, he would have been speaking Aramaic, which was the common language for Jews of the time period. So that was the spoken language, not Hebrew, but Aramaic, which is like a sister language of Hebrew. Jesus, based on the evidence that we have, died in 30 of the Common Era. If we take Mark as the first gospel, dating is tricky. We don't know for sure, but based on what he talks about, what Mark talks about. So for example, in Mark 13, there seems to be an allusion to the destruction of the temple. The temple was destroyed, the Jewish temple, which is where Jews thought that their God lived. It's where Jews practiced sacrifices. Jews would bring an animal to the high priests in the temple and they would do a sacrifice for them. That temple was destroyed by Rome in 70 of the Common Era. So, and the war started around 67. So scholars think that, well, if Mark is alluding to this historical thing that happened in and around 70 with turmoil happening, mid 60s, Mark can't have been written prior to that. So most scholars date Mark to around 70 of the Common Era, maybe a little earlier, maybe a little later. Every New Testament text, every letter by Paul, every gospel is written not in Aramaic, but in Greek. So Jesus, a Jew, speaking Aramaic, dies in 30. Then you have a guy named Paul writing letters, trying to bring non-Jews into the movement. That's happening between 50 and 60. Paul is not interested in talking about what Jesus did day to day. He's not interested in talking and giving any sort of biography about Jesus. Paul is simply trying to bring a Jewish story to non-Jews and welcome them into the movement. Then you have the Gospels. A lot has happened since Jesus died. The movement is now not just for Jews, it's also for non-Jews. And people are talking about a guy who died decades prior in a language that Jesus didn't even speak, perhaps written by people who didn't even know him personally. In fact, Mark, the tradition for Mark, likely the first gospel to have been written, never, ever, ever claimed to have been written by someone who knew Jesus personally. The story of who wrote this first gospel comes from a church leader in the 2nd century of the Common Era named Papias. And Papias claimed that this gospel is written by a guy named Mark, who was a student of Peter, who knew Jesus. All right. So this idea that Mark was a disciple of Jesus and is just writing as Jesus was living or shortly thereafter and really knows what's going on is incorrect. The tradition doesn't even claim that. Do we trust Papias? Who knows? The earliest copies of any of the Gospels Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are written anonymously. We have no idea who wrote them. We don't know where they were written. We don't know the community for whom they were written. And we don't know if they knew Jesus or any of his disciples even. So every piece of evidence that we have about Jesus in the Gospels has to be taken with a massive grain of salt. If one story says that Jesus is reading, who knows? We just don't. If it is attested multiple times over and over again in sources that are not copying each other, in sources that are in the canon and not in the canon, then maybe that's enough to think that Jesus could read himself. There's just not enough. There's not enough evidence. When I say sources that don't know each other, just going back to the idea, so all the Gospels are written in Greek. Mark, Matthew, and Luke sometimes have sentences that are so close together, so almost like, what's the word I'm looking for? Pardon? Well, yes, that is, yes, plagiarism. I wasn't thinking that, but yes, plagiarism, but not in a bad way. Plagiarism was A-okay in antiquity. It was totally fine. It was, you respected a person if you were plagiarizing them. So because Jesus likely, spoke Aramaic and these Gospels are written decades after he died, it would be weird if 40 years after Jesus died, three people in a different language are saying that Jesus said the same thing verbatim. It would be as if one of you 40 years from now quoted this class in Spanish, and then another one of you did it in Spanish, and another one of you did it in Spanish, and you all said, I said the exact same thing in Spanish. That's just not going to happen. So the idea is when the Gospels agree on language, it's likely that they're copying each other. So if Mark is written first, Matthew and Luke sometimes have shared language for Jesus. Matthew copied Mark, Luke copied Mark. So they're borrowing from Mark, but then changing things to fit their own perspective of who Jesus was. So there are absolutely similarities across Gospels, but there are also slight differences. So when a historical Jesus scholar approaches the Gospels, they don't take Mark, Matthew, and Luke as fully separate independent sources. They take them as a combined set with the assumption that Matthew and Luke each have a copy of Mark in front of them when they're writing. And so if Mark, Matthew, and Luke agree on something, that in and of itself, you could say, oh, 3 texts agree on something that Jesus did. That must make it likely historical. No, not for a historical Jesus scholar, because that is a shared set of materials. If Matthew and Luke also have something that Mark has, it doesn't mean that they're all like, yes, absolutely, this is historically a thing. It could be, but it could also be that Matthew and Luke are like, I have no idea, let me just trust Mark on this one and add it in. You just don't know. But if Mark, Matthew, and Luke have something and the Gospel of John has something, and Paul has a random sentence, he has 2 about what Jesus actually did in his life. But if Paul has something, and then the Gospel of Thomas has something, and then the infancy Gospel of Thomas has something, and the Gospel of Mary has something, that are all in agreement, then it's maybe this actually is a thing. Okay, but so I'm saying it takes a lot for a historical Jesus scholar to say, yes, this is it. This happened. Jesus did this. Jesus said this. Jesus was capable in that. It takes a lot. And even if you have multiply attested sources, canonized and not canonized, if you're a good historical Jesus scholar, the furthest place you'll go is saying evidence points to it could have been. So could Jesus have read? Absolutely. Is there enough evidence to say he did for sure? No. Yeah.
How common is it for family in your statute to write?
That's the thing. So,
Sarah,
yeah.
Can you repeat the questions? For
Yes,
this
yes.
audience For the benefit of the Zoom?
Yes.
Thank you.
So great question. The question is, based on what we know, everything is in scare quotes in this class. Based on what we know of Jesus's family life and his status, would it have been likely for him to read or write? And that's where scholars go. So there's a criterion called, is it historically, verifiable? So a scholar will look to all the sources that we have, see how many times this bit of information is stated. The more diverse texts that say it, the better, but even that's not enough, because people could just be relying on the story of 40 years after the fact in a language that Jesus didn't speak, from people that didn't know him personally. But then they will put that bit of information against the historical backdrop, against anything and everything else we may know about him and that we may know about his surroundings. So basically, the only thing that we can say is that Jesus was a Jew who lived in ancient Palestine in the northern region of Galilee. And that might not seem, and that he had ideas about God, and he shared those ideas, and he was deeply committed to his understanding of being Jewish. That might seem like nothing, but we have information about what Jewish life was like in Galilee and in Nazareth. So if we position Jesus in first century ancient Palestine, in first century the Galilean region, in Nazareth, he likely just came from an average family who was working really hard to survive, and was frequented with diversity. Jesus likely could have articulated basic needs in not just Aramaic, but also Greek. But there's no massive school that we've discovered yet, for example, in Nazareth. There's no indication of Jewish life in Nazareth that a common Jew like Jesus would have been highly, highly educated. So some scholars will say, look, just because we don't know, and just because most people couldn't, just because 9 out of 10 people couldn't, doesn't mean that Jesus was one of those 9 out of 10. It's possible that he could have read. But most people couldn't, and most people in that area couldn't. So most scholars will lean into maybe he just couldn't, based on where he lived and, the lack of evidence that he was going to school and, shipped off to Jerusalem for high education. There's no stories about Jesus going to school. Yeah.
I have a language question. When the Jewish people changed from Aramaic to Hebrew, are the languages connected?
Yeah, they're sister languages. So they're very, very common, very similar. Yeah. Oh, sorry. I keep forgetting to do that. When did Jews go from Aramaic to Hebrew in terms of their common language? Yeah, so when Israel was declared a modern nation state, there was a recreation of Hebrew. In fact, Hebrew as a modern language, they're having to constantly create words because they're relying on ancient vocabulary that doesn't fit with the daily life of modernity. So Hebrew became a spoken language once again in modernity. It's not like, in the Middle Ages, Jews are speaking Hebrew or anything like that.
Does anybody still speak Aramaic?
No, it's not a spoken language. Not really. Mm-hmm.
Good morning. This is Dick Ferd. I'm on Zoom. You mentioned earlier that, perhaps Matthew and Luke were sitting down looking at Mark as they were writing. Where does that leave us with Q?
Okay, I'm going to table that because we're going to go there specifically. So the question is, where does that leave us with Q? Q is another source. I'm going to get to that in just a second, but there's a question here as well.
Do the scholars agree that Jesus was a controversial figure and that he was crucified for his controversial behavior?
Yes and no. Okay, the question is, do scholars agree that Jesus was a controversial figure and crucified for being a controversial figure? So there's multiple questions in that question. Scholars agree that Jesus was passionate about his Judaism and was passionate about sharing his understanding of Judaism. That, however, was not necessarily unique. There were lots of, that's the one thing that I say you can be anachronistic on. If you go to Torah study today at a synagogue, you're just going to see Jews arguing about how best to interpret something. Jewishness today is marked by massive difference and debate. There's no creed in Judaism. There's nothing that says to be Jewish, you must believe X, Y, and Z. That's why you have atheist rabbis. It's very common. Same thing in antiquity. Difference in debate, difference in debate, difference in debate. So Jesus was a Jew amongst other Jews entering heated conversation of difference and debate. So is he having, heated talk? Yes. Is that abnormal? No. Was Jesus crucified because of that? Yes and no. The evidence that we have about Jesus's, so that's one thing that is multiply attested, is Jesus's crucifixion. So let me rephrase. What do we know about Jesus? He was a Jew living in ancient Palestine in the 1st century of the Common Era, had a lot of passionate thoughts about Judaism and shared those ideas, and he was crucified. Crucifixion was a specific Roman punishment. Jews did not kill people by crucifixion. That would not have, if Jews had the last say of killing Jesus, it would have been by stoning or hanging. Crucifixion is specific to Rome. The evidence that we have is Jesus's last week was spent in Jerusalem for Passover. Whereas Passover today can happen in one's own homes. In antiquity, the commandment was to travel to Jerusalem if you could. So here's one point on the side of maybe Jesus did perhaps have some means. He could go to Jerusalem. We don't have evidence that Jesus was able to go to Jerusalem every year. In all likelihood, he couldn't, but at least, when he was 33, he went to Jerusalem. So he's going to Jerusalem for Passover, presumably to, celebrate the Passover and buy an animal for a priest to sacrifice on his behalf. And like other Jews of the time period, he has things to say. And like many other Jews of the time period, he has things to say about how the temple is being run. So the temple is the governmental center and theological center of Judaism at this time period. And most Jews thought that it was corrupt, that the elite within the temple center were hijacking everything, to the point that some Jewish groups said, forget this, we're out of here, we're leaving. Like, we love the temple, we love our God, but we can't handle what's going on in this government. We're gonna do our own thing in the desert, and good luck to all of you. Hopefully something will change. Other Jews, were wanting to take up arms against those in the temple. So difference in debate about Jewish theology was happening, and difference in debate about Jewish policy with regards to the temple was happening. And Rome knew this. So the Roman officials knew that there was conflict in the Jewish world, and that when you have Jews traveling to the same place where, it's the center of the conflict, you can easily have some kind of uprising. Rome also knew that many Jews were sick and tired of not having full autonomy. So even though Jews had their spot in Jerusalem with the temple, they still had to abide by the grander Roman ruling, which is part of why some Jews were so pissed off about what was happening in the temple center, because the temple elite were abiding by Roman officials and sort of interacting with them and doing what Rome wanted. And so Rome knew that not just were Jews arguing with each other about things in the temple, but Jews were also really fed up with Rome. And so again, if you have a bunch of Jews coming together, there could be an uprising. So for Passover, the Roman guards were everywhere. They were on high alert. And if the story of Jesus's crucifixion tells us anything, it's how easy it was to be crucified under Rome. Did Jesus do something crazy? I don't think so. He likely went into the temple, had an argument with some other Jewish elite. Some Jewish elite in the temple were like, this guy's getting a following. We can't have this right now. Tells a guard over here. The guard steps in, takes him, brutally mocks him, beats him, tortures him publicly, and crucifies him. So to answer your question, yes and no. He has thoughts, like a lot of other Jews, but it was very easy to be caught by Rome and killed. He was just another common Jew in the eyes of Rome. He's a nobody. He's crucified publicly, he's humiliated, and most bodies were left to be eaten by non-human animals after they died. So he's nothing to them. Yeah, and then I'm going to get specifically to Mark.
Question about the Muslims going to Mecca. Does that have any connection with the Passover thing? Or, I mean, or is it the same idea?
In terms of like a pilgrimage? Yeah, it's just, their own pilgrimage, but not, of traveling to a holy site, but it's not specific to.
Please repeat the question.
Oh, sorry. The question was, is there any connection to Muslims traveling to Mecca on a pilgrimage? And just in the sense that those who are spiritually invested in something make pilgrimages and visit sacred sites. Okay, so this is a lot of information. I want to relate it all back to Mark, and then we'll go more specifically in the next couple classes and unpack who Jesus is for Mark. So we have limited resources that tell us anything about who Jesus was. And each source gives us a slightly different version of who Jesus was. So when we're doing a class on Mark, we have to understand that we're not doing a class on the historical Jesus, because if we were doing a class on the historical Jesus, we would be talking about Mark, Matthew, Luke, John, Paul, anything not canonized, but we're talking about Mark. Mark was likely written around 70 of the Common Era, likely the first gospel to have been written. It's the shortest of the canonical gospels, and it's a different story from Matthew, from Luke, from John, and from any of the gospels that aren't canonized. So this class is on Mark's perspective of who Jesus was, Mark's good news of who Jesus was. And when we say Mark, we really have no idea who this person is. Did this person know Jesus personally? Maybe. Did he know Peter? Maybe. But we don't know. The first gospels don't have an author put onto them. So we don't know who this person is. What we do know is that this person opens up his gospel with the declaration that this person, Jesus, Joshua, is the Messiah and is the Son of God. So we are ushered in from the first line into a story written by someone who is stating, or at least wanting us to think, that Jesus is the Messiah and Jesus is the Son of God. We are going to, in the next few classes, question if that is satire. It is unclear if Mark is actually being serious in these lines based on what happens later in the gospel. But for now, let's just say that we believe, that Mark believes that this person is the Messiah and is the Son of God. Next class, we will unpack what does that mean for someone to believe that Jesus is the Messiah in the first century? What does it mean for someone to believe that Jesus is the Son of God in the first century? And how does this specific author unpack that first opening line? Does he live by it? Does he create a Jesus that fits the bill of a Messiah and a Son of God for the first century? Or does he create a Jesus that sways from it? And that's a huge question in scholarship. Some people think, yeah, this author really does think that Jesus is it. And other scholars think, I don't know if this is satire from start to finish. But I want to just get back to the question of Q. So if you think that Mark is the first gospel to have been written, you again notice that Matthew and Luke share certain lines with Mark, which then leads scholars to think that Matthew and Luke copied Mark. There is another source, or another possible source out there called Q. Q stands for Quelle, which just means source in German. Most modern biblical scholars, most early biblical scholars are from Germany. And so German words are sort of filtering through the scholarship. There are instances where Matthew and Luke agree so closely with each other on language that isn't found in Mark. So the idea is, if Mark, Matthew, and Luke are very close in language, writing decades after Jesus died in a language Jesus didn't speak, the idea is Matthew and Luke are copying Mark. But there are instances where Matthew and Luke agree with each other, and it's not found in Mark. And so the idea is that they also had a copy of another source. We haven't found that source. We don't know if it actually exists, but many scholars who study this, who are hardcore text critics, do believe that another source was out there, and that in addition to Mark, Matthew and Luke had a copy of it. It, whatever it was called, we don't know, but scholars have called it Q for source, another source out there. So again, this is a lot of information, a lot of, this is the starting point for doing Mark work. For doing Mark work, the starting point is, this is not a picture into the historical Jesus, because Jesus is depicted very specifically for Mark and different from other gospels. Mark is not the only gospel to have been written. There are lots of other gospels that were written that were canonized and also not canonized. There are likely sources that we have no idea about, that we haven't found yet, or will never find. We know very, very little about the historical Jesus based on the evidence that we have. If it's in multiple spots and fits the time period, we can say that Jesus was a Jew who cared very much about his Jewishness and was crucified under Roman rule. Beyond that, we just don't know. But the good news is that we can ask questions of, well, who is this person for Mark, right? Even if Mark isn't giving us a full-on factual-based history of Jesus, maybe that doesn't matter. In antiquity, to talk about the life of a person, biography, it's not the same thing as today. So if we are to write a biography today, we care very much about getting the facts. In antiquity, to write about the life of a person was to write about the goodness or badness of a person. Do you want to emulate this person? Do you want to follow this person? Do you want to stay away from this person? And what stories can I tell to persuade you to either follow this person or not follow this person? So Mark is inviting us into his understanding of who Jesus was without care for fact in the same way that we think of today. And for that writer in antiquity, that's how you did it. Mark is not interested in giving us a picture of the historical Jesus. Mark is interested in giving us a story of this person, Jesus. And we're going to tap into that story next class and unpack who is Jesus in this story. It's a different story from Matthew, from Luke, from John, but who is Jesus for this person? And that's where we're headed next. Whew, a lot of... Are there any questions based on anything, any intro material today?
Could you say about yourself? I mean, maybe everybody else knows.
Sure, yeah. The question is, can I say a little bit about myself? So I am a biblical scholar. I have a PhD in biblical studies with a focus on New Testament and Christian origins. My area of specialization is the 1st century of the Common Era. Very much a fan of Jesus. I'm not Christian, I'm a Jew, but I'm a huge fan, and that I've dedicated my entire life to studying him. So this is what I do. I'm a professor at Loyola Marymount University. I teach undergrads and graduate students. I also do a lot of work in contemporary theory. So while I'm very much interested in history and unpacking what we can know about this person, which unfortunately is very, very little, I also like to play. I like to play with text. So I like to ask different kinds of questions of a story and see what we might notice based on the kind of question we're asking. So for example, what might happen if we bring a feminist lens into the conversation? Well, we notice that we haven't really said anything about a woman for the past 45 minutes or past hour. And what does that mean? So I like to play with text, but I'm also at the same time very interested in history. I do want to... So just one second. I do want to, before we get to the next question, just let you know that everything that I have said does need to be taken with a grain of salt. And there are ways to push back to almost everything that I have said. So even when I say pretty adamantly that it's unlikely Jesus could read or write, or go to school, he did live within a day's trip to a city called Sepphoris, where there was lots of trade and lots of people around. And maybe, he learned how to communicate and got some education in that major city. So just keep in mind that even when I say in all likelihood Jesus did or didn't do something, I can find a way to counter it. So we just don't know a lot of things. And even though I'm trying my best to give some sort of clarity, all the clarity I'm giving can in all likelihood be twisted and turned differently.
Couple of questions.
Yeah.
These four gospels are not attributed, right? But we know that other writings of the period are attributed, Josephus, Tacitus, and so on. Do scholars have an explanation for that? And then second, I agree that a tradition about attribution is not the same as proof of attribution. My sense is that current scholarship doesn't give much credit to apostolic or church father traditions about the origins of the gospels. And I wonder, when is that true and why?
Okay, so the question is, it's pointing something out in that none of these gospels are written with an author's name on it, which is interesting because it's not like it was uncommon to put your name on something. It was common. Historians said, hey, I'm a historian and I'm writing this story. So like, why aren't these gospel writers putting their own name on it? And the answer is, I don't know. I really don't know. I wish I did. A hunch could be, maybe they're afraid. Rome is not on board with Jesus at all for a couple hundred years. And in fact, they're the ones who killed him. So it's not safe necessarily to, be like, hey, I'm a Jesus follower, I'm doing this thing. So it could be for safety. Also, it could be, just to save face. The New Testament writing in terms of language and grammar and style is not up to par with the other texts that we have. So when you learn Greek, for example, if you're a classicist, you learn a certain kind of Greek. And if you're a New Testament scholar, you learn Koine Greek. Koine Greek is like a really sloppy Greek because the writers of the New Testament aren't as educated as other writers. So maybe in addition, they're just like, look, this is, I'm embarrassed to put my name on it, or I want to save myself, or I want the text to survive. And maybe if no one can trace it, it can live a little longer. Those are some possibilities. The second question is related to early church fathers. So as the movement grows throughout the early centuries of the Common Era, you start to have leaders of the movement make claims about Jesus and even make claims about who might have written these sources. And the question was, how much do scholars rely on what these early church fathers are saying about Jesus as a figure in history? And the answer is not much. Scholars lean into church fathers in the sense of wanting to understand, what did this church father think about Jesus? And what does that say about the church father? What does that say about the community that the church father is writing to? As opposed to, Papias in the 2nd century says that a follower of Peter wrote the Gospel of Mark. That must be true. No, a scholar will say maybe, but who knows? What does that tell us about Papias? Why did Papias want the story to be that a follower of Peter who followed Jesus wrote the gospel? Does that make sense? So it's the same thing as Mark. Like, scholars doing Markan work are less interested in what does this say about the historical Jesus and more about what is Mark's version. If you're doing historical Jesus research, you are not relying only on Mark. Even if Mark is written first, to do Markan work in a vacuum is not to do historical Jesus work. It's to do work on what does this gospel say. Any other questions?
Sure, this is Dick again on Zoom. We like to tend to think of writings, whether the Gospels or others, as kind of a linear chronological event. In other words, Mark was written, then Luke was written, then John was written, etc. Is it possible that they're more interactive? Meaning, they wrote them, they read something else, then they went back and wrote version 2. And what we're reading today is version 27.
Excellent question. Excellent question. And we'll get more into detail on this when we finally get to open Mark. So yeah, y'all are lucky. I don't let my students open up a New Testament for 3 weeks into the Intro to New Testament class, because there's just too much to do before we can even open the source. So we at least get to open the material after one class here. But the question is, sometimes we think, okay, Mark is written, then Matthew, then Luke, then John. Might there be a little more messiness to it? And in fact, is it not a one and done deal? Like, might the versions we have be an edited and an edited and an edited and an edited version? And the answer is yes. We have copies of 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 copies. We do not have any original source. And when we look to the earliest fragments that we have, there are different versions. So we have different versions of the Gospel of Mark. And the earliest copy that we have of Mark does not have the happy ending that our New Testament has. So our New Testament Gospel of Mark ends with Jesus ascending and his story of ascension being shared with others, and the movement then being applied to be shared further and grow. The earliest version of Mark that we have ends with Jesus being crucified, 3 women going to the tomb, seeing that it's empty, and being so scared that they do nothing. And yeah, so even the Gospels are not written by one person. In all likelihood, someone else said, I like this one. This is the gospel that I can get behind, except I need something more in the end, and added an ending. So yes, we have copies of copies of copies of copies, likely not as many editorial moves as we might think, just because people are writing by hand and don't have like a backspace button on a keyboard. But still, people are copying each other. And when you copy by hand, you make mistakes. People are exhausted. Sometimes people change the text on purpose. So you have the first writer, and then you have another writer saying, okay, let me make another copy so that others can read it. And then let me make another copy so that others can read it. You're going to mess up. You might say a line twice. You might skip a line. You might be like, I'm going to change this word around, or this grammar is really sloppy. Let me fix the grammar. Matthew and Luke, for example, clean up Mark's grammar in their versions. So yes, we have changes and edits on purpose and by accident. We have additions, but we also have to keep in mind that the writing process is not as easy or smooth as it is today. We can't easily delete a paragraph or move a paragraph, or they can't move around their prose like we can today. Is that a hand in the back? Okay. Yeah.
What about when it says that all the scriptures have been inspired by God, and so when you talk about the human spirit, or whatnot, like some of us choose to believe that every word was like almost dictated by the Holy Spirit of God, and so the notion of saying we have copies of copies of copies, and maybe there were mistakes or add-ons, could be possible, but yet by faith, I just believe that all scriptures are inspired by God.
Yeah. So great comment. So the comment is, we could say there are all these changes and just chalk it up to human error, but what about the belief that even in all of this multiplicity, it's divinely inspired? So that is a belief that many have. The Gospels don't claim that, verbatim. That's not like, written down or anything like that, but that alone doesn't negate the interpretation and that many people do have, which is that these are inspired by a divine being. And so there are a couple ways, that if you're an academician, so academics enter this conversation, not from a faith-based perspective, but many academics do have faith. So many New Testament scholars are Christ followers, and, even lean into this belief that, these are divinely inspired, and trying to, take everything apart, still believe that this is somehow divinely inspired. So there are a couple ways that academics, engage that. One is, if you take on the assumption that all of this is divinely inspired, we're still humans, and humans interpret everything based on their own positionality, based on their own language system, based on their own wants, biases. So you could have variations of what that God is telling you. So, and you can have biases and interpretations of what that God is telling you. So say whoever wrote Mark is getting the information from a Godhead. Well, that information is being interpreted based on Mark's own reference points and Mark's own understanding of the world. So divinely inspired, human, and then there's this filter in between, and we get Mark's understanding of a divine inspiration. Another place that some scholars go is the beauty of the multiplicity. If you believe that this is divinely inspired, don't get mad that there's differences. How lovely to live in a world where there's multiplicity and different interpretation. How beautiful to have a New Testament canon that has 4 different versions of a Jesus. Might that actually be something really special instead of something to fear? Oftentimes people take the scholarly point that all the Gospels are different as like a negative. It doesn't have to be a negative. It could actually be something really beautiful. Right? There are 2 creation accounts in the opening chapters of the book of Genesis that could be beautiful. Right? That we are so limited in our view of the world that we think everything has to be one and done, but what if there's so much more? And what if the fact that there are multiple interpretations and multiple versions is actually leaning into something quite remarkable? Mm-hmm.
I like what you were saying about how debate was a big part of the culture at the time, because to me, that seems like that is sort of like part of who you're created to be with debate. You argue that it is a humanness. Yeah. And that we shouldn't expect necessarily for the gospel to just have everything neatly laid out for us. We should spend each day debating it, arguing it, thinking about it, rolling it over and pondering it.
Yes. And that is, that's a very Jewish thing to say. I used to teach Hebrew school when I was finishing my PhD, and I would be training 6th graders, which, bless anyone who teaches 6th graders. But,
your Zoom participants didn't get that question.
Oh, thank you. The question, it was a comment of, leaning into the humanness of difference and debate and sort of the potential goodness of difference and debate. And so my response is thinking about when I had sixth graders at Hebrew school, training for their B'nai Mitzvot. That's your last year before, you're really called to the Torah to have a bar and bat mitzvah. Most students are bar bat mitzvah in 7th grade. And so part of becoming a bar or bat mitzvah is to engage a Torah section and have something to say about it. And, look, I'm not a traditional person. So the kind of synagogue that would hire me is always going to be against the grain somehow. So I was teaching at a very open, against the grain synagogue. Students had all sorts of different opinions, and many students would open a verse and be really upset about it, would read something, and they don't get to really choose their verse. It's based on when the date of year, and you're told this is what you need to talk about. And sometimes students would read it and just be like, I'm so upset. This really bothers me. I don't find this ethical. What do I do? And I would say, how beautiful that you have something that sparks a thought within yourself, even if it's something that is different from what you're reading. And we have that in the Gospels. Matthew disagreed with Mark and wrote something a little different, and Luke disagreed and wrote something a little different, and John had a different idea too, and they're doing it. It's kind of, yeah, it's lovely to disagree with something and have a different conclusion from someone else, so long as, you know, hopefully we respect each other in the process. Yes, we are at time. Next time we get to open up Mark. But if you have any questions about like what all the work we have to do before we open up Mark, I'll hang around for a little bit. But thanks for your time. And yeah, I'll see you next time. Yeah.
Okay, so I really enjoyed this class.
Thanks, I'm so glad.
You did a great job. But